The wind had a way of gnawing through every layer of fabric, every seam of a parka, every pore of exposed skin. On nights like this, the cold wasn't just a presence outside the body. It seeped into the marrow, an invisible frost that claimed you from the inside out. The small fishing outpost, little more than a cluster of prefabricated cabins nailed into the permafrost, seemed like a matchbox village swallowed by the vast white desert. The lake stretched beyond, a flat plate of ice without end. Pale blue and silver under a moon blurred by drifting clouds. They called it Hewitt Lake, though none of them were entirely sure if that was the proper name or just something borrowed from old maps. The native men in the village 100 miles south never spoke of it. When asked, they'd give a look, a silence heavy as stone, and change the subject. For the group stationed here for the winter, 6 men in all, half fishermen, half hired hands to keep the outpost functioning. That silence was shrugged off as superstition. Remote places always carried legends, and when you were paid enough to stay, you learned to ignore them. The cabins sat with their windows glowing weakly against the polar night, like lanterns half swallowed in snow. Inside, it smelled of kerosene heaters, wool damp from sweat and melting frost, and the faint reek of fish stored in barrels out back. They had been there 3 weeks, and already the walls seemed to press closer each evening. There was no road in winter, no easy way out. The radio stuttered and coughed with interference. Helicopters didn't fly this far unless there was a disaster. For men who thought themselves hardened, ex-loggers, drifters, 1 or 2 who never spoke of their pasts. There was still a weight to the silence outside, a pressure that gnawed during the endless dark. And sometimes, when the wind died, that silence was broken by something else. It was first noticed by Donnelly, the youngest of them, barely 22 and still soft in the face. He claimed, one night after hauling gear back from the shoreline, that he heard a sound beneath the ice. The others laughed at him, slapping his back, saying he'd heard the groan of ice shifting or the sigh of trapped air. Donnelly didn't argue, but the way he chewed at his lip told another story. The truth was, most of them had heard something too, though none wanted to be the first to say it. In the distance, across the frozen sheet, a low note sometimes trembled, as if the lake itself were breathing. On other nights, sharper noises, like knocks, like fists against a door, muffled by distance. Once, Torres swore he heard what sounded like a cry. Not an animal, not a fox or an owl. A cry that bent with human shape, swallowed by the ice. They ignored it as best they could. Men who came this far north weren't the kind who admitted to fear easily. They joked, drank cheap whiskey by the heater, played cards. But as the night stretched longer, the noises did too. The first night it came close. McCarthy was outside dumping fish guts to keep scavenger animals away from the cabins. He stopped, boot soles squealing in snow, because he heard his name. Just that. Clear as a breath in his ear, though the air was dead still. He turned fast, expecting Donnelly or Torres behind him, but no one was there. His eyes fell on the ice. The lake surface reflected the moon in a million fractures, each one pale and sharp like glass. He told no one. Instead, he poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey more than usual and sat by the stove long past midnight, staring at the frost crawling across the window pane. What gnawed at them wasn't just the sound, but the impossibility of it. The ice was thick enough to carry trucks, layered over 100 years, deeper than they could measure without heavy drills. Nothing should have lived under it. No current, no voice. And yet, each day it seemed closer. Donnelly began to change. He slept less, rising at strange hours, wandering to the lake's edge with his parka half-buttoned, eyes vacant. Once, Torres dragged him back by the arm, demanding to know what he was doing out there. Donnelly only muttered that someone was calling for help. His lips were cracked, his eyes ringed with purple shadow. The older men mocked him, but only when he wasn't listening. They too had begun to hear more clearly. A chorus that swelled beneath the ice, soft as breath against glass, moaning and sighing. Once, when the cabin stove went silent for a moment, they swore they heard words. Not just sounds, but syllables bent into something familiar. It was easier to talk louder, to shuffle cards harder than to admit it. One night the wind stopped entirely. The air lay heavy, and the aurora flared green above the horizon, a curtain of ghost light rippling across the black. The men huddled in their bunks, but none slept. The silence was too total. Then came the sound, long, drawn, like someone pressing their hand against the frozen underside of the lake, dragging nails across it. It quivered through the ground, into their bones. Donnelly sat up in his bunk, eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. No one answered, but they did. And then, layered over it, came the sob. High, fragile, breaking, like a child crying into the dark. The men sat rigid, hearts hammering. No one moved to the window. No one wanted to see. The sob went on for what felt like hours, weaving up and down, sometimes too faint to catch, sometimes so loud it felt inches away. When at last it faded, Torres swore he could still hear it echoing inside his skull. By morning, nothing was said. Men went about their chores, hauling buckets of snow to melt, checking the barrels, tightening ropes against the wind. Yet they all moved slower, as though afraid of the stillness between sounds. The lake remained there, silent, perfect, endless. But each man knew, though none said it aloud, silence was not safety. Silence was waiting. The next morning broke with no dawn, only a faint lightening of the sky beyond the horizon, a pale bruise beneath the weight of the polar night. The men had long since lost the rhythm of ordinary days. Night bled into day without distinction, broken only by the mechanical duties of survival. They marked time by meals, by chores, by the slow diminishing of supplies. But after the night of sobs beneath the ice, the air inside the cabins felt different. Stale, crowded, heavy with breaths held too long. Men who had once spoken freely now muttered in short bursts, eyes avoiding each other's. No one wanted to be the first to admit what they'd heard, as though to put words to it would give it weight, make it flesh. Torres was the first to crack. He was a thick-bodied man, all shoulders and scars, who had fought forest fires in the lower 48 before drifting north. He didn't scare easily. But when he came in from the shoreline that morning, snow stiff in his beard, his face was gray. "There's something wrong with the ice," he muttered, throwing his gloves onto the stove. His hands shook as he held them out to the heat. McCarthy glanced at him, chewing a strip of dried fish. "Ice is ice." Torres shook his head. "No, I saw cracks, fresh ones, long ones, like something pressing from underneath." The room went silent. Donnelly's spoon clattered in his tin cup. No one laughed this time. That afternoon, they walked together to the edge of Hewitt Lake. The wind had stilled, leaving the surface eerily calm, a perfect mirror of cloud and pale moon. There, along the shoreline, they saw it. A vein-like fracture, thin but jagged, spidering out across the ice. It ran farther than they could see, splitting and branching like glass shattered by a slow hand. "Could be shifting temperatures," one of the older men said, though his voice wavered. But the air was steady, the cold unbroken, and the cracks weren't random. They seemed to arc, to bend, to converge toward the deeper center of the lake, as though pointing to something. That night, no one wanted to sleep. The sobbing did not return, but the silence itself was worse, stretched taut, waiting to snap. McCarthy drank until his eyes drooped, only to jolt awake at every creak of the cabin timbers. Donnelly sat hunched by the window, staring out at the faint gleam of the lake. Near midnight, the first scream came. It was short, sharp, echoing. The men bolted upright, boots half-laced, parkas thrown over shoulders. They stumbled into the snow, breath fogging. The scream had come from the direction of the lake. At the shoreline, they found Jensen, the quietest of them, kneeling in the snow. His face was bloodless, his mouth open in ragged gasps. He was staring at the ice. "Something's under there," he whispered, though his voice trembled more than the words. The others peered out. The cracks gleamed faintly, catching moonlight like veins of silver. And then they saw movement. Not beneath the surface, not exactly. It was a ripple, a distortion in the ice itself, as though something vast shifted below. Pressing upward, the men staggered back. Torres grabbed Jensen by the arm, dragging him away. But Jensen fought him, screaming that there was a woman down there, that he saw her face. His voice broke into sobs, hysterical, teeth chattering though the air was still. They carried him back to the cabin by force. His cries filled the small space until McCarthy slammed a hand over his mouth. When Jensen finally quieted, he lay on his bunk trembling, whispering a name none of the others recognized. By morning, the fracture had widened. Where there had been one jagged vein, now there were dozens, radiating outward. The lake looked less like a mirror, more like a spider's web, fragile and strained. The men argued in low voices. Some demanded they pack what they could and set off for the South Village, storm or no storm. Others insisted they wait, that the cracks were dangerous, yes, but still just ice. In truth, none of them wanted to cross the frozen sheet again. They feared what lay beneath. It was Donnelly who broke the stalemate. He rose abruptly, pulling on his boots, and announced he was going back to the shoreline. "If there's something under there," he said, his voice hollow, "we need to know." They tried to stop him, but he shook them off. His eyes had the flat, fevered gleam of a man already halfway gone. Torres followed, cursing, unwilling to let the kid walk out alone. The rest trailed behind, pulled by dread as much as duty. At the lake's edge, Donnelly dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against the ice. His breath fogged the surface. He stayed like that for a long moment, motionless, listening. Then he began to smile. "They're down there," he whispered. "I can hear them. They're calling for me." Torres swore and yanked him back. But even as Donnelly struggled, the others froze. For now they too could hear it. Not muffled, not distant, but sharp, clear, immediate. Voices, dozens of them, swelling beneath the ice like trapped air. Some cried for help. Some moaned in agony. And some whispered names. Their names. The sound rose, echoing across the lake, as though the ice itself were a throat. The men clapped hands over their ears, but the voices burrowed through, vibrating in the skull, rattling the teeth. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. They staggered back to camp, each man hollow-eyed, trembling. No one spoke. The fire hissed in the stove, the only sound. Jensen had gone still, staring at the ceiling as though carved in stone. Donnelly sat muttering to himself, rocking slightly, a smile frozen on his cracked lips. When Torres finally broke the silence, his voice was raw. "We need to leave. Now. I don't care about the storm. I don't care if we freeze in the snow. Better that than stay here." No one argued. Not anymore. But deep down, each man knew the truth. The lake wasn't going to let them leave. The storm came on the third day, not with a roar, but with a slow crawl, a gathering of winds that thickened the air until the horizon vanished. Snow whipped sideways, veiling the lake and the cabins in a constant shifting curtain. The outpost seemed swallowed, reduced to a few dim windows flickering in the void. No man ventured far. Even walking from one cabin to the next risked losing sight of the path, of being erased into the storm's white jaws. The men stayed inside, pressed close to the heaters, listening to the howl beyond the walls. But the storm wasn't enough to mask the other sounds. The voices still came, threading beneath the wind, crawling through the cracks in the windows, rising up from the frozen ground itself. McCarthy tried to drown it in whiskey, but it made the whispers stronger, not weaker. Torres muttered prayers in Spanish, though his voice shook. Jensen hardly moved, a shadow in his bunk, lips silently forming the same name over and over, as though it tethered him to something unseen. Donnelly was the worst. He barely ate, barely slept, spending hours by the window, face pressed close to the frost. Sometimes he laughed under his breath, a child's giggle that made the others stiffen. He insisted he could see figures beneath the ice, shapes moving, arms outstretched. Once, when Torres tried to drag him back, Donnelly hissed like an animal, eyes fever-bright, and spat words no one understood. On the second night of the storm, they heard knocking. At first soft, almost delicate, like fingers tapping on a door. It came from beneath the floorboards, from the frozen ground itself. The men froze, every head turning toward the sound. Then it came again, louder. Knock, knock, knock. Jensen clapped his hands over his ears and began to weep. Torres shouted, trying to drown the sound, but his voice only made the knocking seem clearer. By morning, the storm had quieted, though the snow lay waist-deep outside. The men stumbled out to find the world transformed, drifts burying the cabins halfway, the lake hidden beneath a white shroud. But as the wind eased, they saw it again. The cracks, wider now, branching like veins across the lake, spreading outward from some unseen heart at the center. And something else. Near the shoreline, where the snow had been swept thin by gusts, the ice was translucent. Through it, faint shapes seemed pressed against the underside, pale and blurred. Faces. The men stood in silence, staring down. The shapes were distorted, warped by refraction, but they had eyes, mouths, hollow sockets that seemed to strain upward. Some were twisted in silent screams, others slack as if sleeping. Torres swore and backed away, crossing himself. "They're dead," he rasped. "Frozen in the ice. Christ help us." But McCarthy shook his head. His face was ashen, his lips cracked. "No, dead bodies don't move." For as they watched, one of the pale faces shifted. Not a trick of light, not an illusion. It turned, slow as driftwood in a current, its mouth opening in a silent cry. The men staggered back. Donnelly only smiled. "They want us to let them out," he whispered. That night, they argued by the dim light of the stove. Torres demanded they leave at first light, storm or no storm, lake or no lake. Jensen sat silent, rocking, whispering that he heard his sister's voice calling. McCarthy drank until his words slurred, insisting they wait it out. And Donnelly only stared at the floor, lips moving in some private prayer to the ice itself. The knocking returned, louder now, shaking the very walls. At times, it came from the ground, at times from the windows, and once from inside the stove, a hollow thudding that sent sparks leaping as though something beat against the iron from within. None of them slept. At dawn, or what passed for dawn in the endless night, Donnelly was gone. His bunk lay empty, boots missing, parka gone. Snow had drifted through the cabin door, left ajar, and footprints led toward the lake. Torres cursed and pulled on his gear, dragging McCarthy with him. They stumbled through the drifts, breath burning in their lungs, until they reached the shoreline. There, at the edge of the cracks, Donnelly knelt. His gloves lay discarded, bare hands pressed against the ice. He was speaking softly, words lost in the wind, but his face was rapturous, ecstatic. The others shouted, but he didn't move. And then, before their eyes, the ice beneath him bulged upward. It flexed like skin, pushing against his palms. Donnelly laughed, throwing his arms wide. The surface split with a sickening crack, and water surged upward in a burst of black spray. Torres lunged forward, grabbing Donnelly by the coat, but it was too late. Something seized him from below. Hands, arms, pale shapes swarming in the water. Donnelly screamed, not in terror but in joy, as he was yanked downward, vanishing beneath the ice. The crack sealed almost instantly, the water freezing hard once more, leaving only jagged scars across the surface. Torres collapsed on the snow, gasping, staring at the spot where Donnelly had vanished. McCarthy hauled him back, both of them stumbling, choking, retreating to the cabin like men fleeing a fire. When they burst inside, Jensen looked up from his bunk with hollow eyes. "He's with them now," he whispered. "They've been waiting for us." The words sank into the silence like stones into dark water. And for the first time, the men realized this wasn't just something beneath the lake. The lake itself was alive. The cabin was quieter without Donnelly, but the silence was no comfort. It pressed heavier than before, like a suffocating blanket. The men sat in shadows, faces drawn, eyes hollow. No one spoke of what had happened on the lake. No one dared. Yet every time the wind rattled the walls, they flinched, waiting for the sound of voices bleeding through again. Torres couldn't shake the image. Donnelly's smile, wide and unbroken, as the ice split beneath him. It haunted every blink, every shallow breath. When he closed his eyes, he swore he could still hear Donnelly laughing under the frozen surface, muffled by 100 feet of ice. By the second night, the voices returned. They came clearer now, sharper, as though the storm had swept away whatever barrier muffled them before. The men froze where they sat, listening as the cries swelled from beneath the ground. At first, they were indistinct, shapeless, but soon they became familiar. Jensen was the first to react. He leapt from his bunk, eyes wide, tears freezing on his cheeks. "That's her," he sobbed. "That's my sister." His voice cracked like splitting wood. "She's calling for me." The others tried to hold him back, but Jensen fought with a strength born of madness. He clawed at the door, screaming her name. When Torres struck him across the face, Jensen went still, trembling, lips quivering with broken words. McCarthy sat slumped, staring into his tin cup. He hadn't touched his whiskey since Donnelly vanished, but his hands shook as though drunk. The voices gnawed at him, whispering names from his past, his dead wife, his lost son. He clenched his fists so hard his knuckles bled, yet still the whispers threaded through. Torres muttered prayers again, voice ragged, pleading with saints who had never known this land, this ice. But even prayer faltered when the knocking came. It began at the walls this time, a hollow rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. Knock, knock, knock. It traveled the cabin like footsteps, circling, pressing closer, closer. The men sat rigid, eyes darting to the door, the windows, the stove. Then came the voices again, this time not from beneath, but outside. They called from the snow. Soft at first, then rising, the sound of dozens of throats crying, moaning, begging. Some voices were sharp with agony, others tender, coaxing. They called by name. Each man heard the voice of someone he had lost, someone who should have been buried thousands of miles away. Jensen broke again. He bolted to the window, pressed his face to the glass, sobbing. Torres dragged him back, shouting, but the sound outside only swelled, wrapping the cabin in a chorus of the dead. And then came the laughter. Donnelly's laughter. High, sharp, boyish, it rose above the rest, cutting through the storm of cries. It was close, too close, like he was standing right outside the door. The men froze, terror choking their lungs. Jensen collapsed onto the floor, weeping, muttering, "He's back, he's back." No one opened the door. Not that night. By morning, the storm had calmed again. The world lay stark and brittle, snow glazed with ice that glittered like glass. The men stumbled out, exhausted, eyes bloodshot. The lake stretched before them, more fractured than ever. Veins radiating outward, black water visible in the seams. And there, at the center of the lake, they saw movement, figures. Dozens of them, shapes shifting beneath the translucent sheet. Arms outstretched, mouths open in silent screams. They pressed upward, clawing against the barrier, their forms warped and pale. The ice buckled with their weight. Spiderweb cracks snapping outward like brittle bones. Jensen fell to his knees, sobbing, reaching toward them. Torres dragged him back, cursing, but even he couldn't tear his eyes away. Among the shifting shapes, one face floated closer to the surface. A young man, lips curled in a grin. Donnelly, his eyes locked with theirs, gleaming with an unnatural light, his mouth moving though no sound came. McCarthy staggered backward, shaking his head. No, that's not him. That's not. His words broke into a hoarse shout. He turned and stumbled toward the cabin, retreating like a man fleeing fire. But Jensen couldn't look away. He crawled across the snow, palms bleeding, eyes wide and desperate. "Please," he whispered. "Please, I'm coming." Torres grabbed him, fought him. But Jensen was gone in spirit already. With a sudden burst of strength, he ripped free and flung himself onto the ice. The lake answered. The ice split with a deafening crack, water erupting upward, dragging Jensen down. His scream tore the air, sharp and raw, then cut short as he vanished beneath the surface. The water froze over almost instantly, leaving only fractured scars. Torres staggered back, shaking, staring at the spot. "God help us," he whispered. His breath fogged in the air, trembling. The lake lay still again, faces fading back into shadow. But the laughter lingered, faint, echoing in their skulls. That night, only 2 men remained awake by the stove. Torres, pacing like a caged animal, muttering curses under his breath, and McCarthy, hunched over with his head in his hands. Neither spoke of leaving anymore. They both knew there was nowhere left to go. Torres hadn't slept in 2 nights. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to surrender. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jensen's final expression, an odd mixture of terror and relief. As the ice folded around him, McCarthy barely spoke anymore. He lingered by the stove, staring into the flames as though hypnotized, lips moving in whispers no one else could hear. He refused food, ignored Torres's attempts at conversation, and sometimes laughed at nothing. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollow. Torres wasn't sure if the man was praying or unraveling. The cabin smelled of damp wood and sweat. The whiskey was gone. The storm outside had grown heavier again, burying the cabin under thick drifts. The windows had frozen into opaque sheets, leaving them blind to the world beyond. The wind screamed through the cracks, like a living thing, desperate to get in. Then, one night, it did. It began as a vibration underfoot, subtle at first, then pulsing, rhythmic. The stove rattled, the tin cups trembled. Torres pressed his palm to the floor and felt it, a steady thump like a slow, monstrous heartbeat. McCarthy looked up, eyes wide, lips twitching. "You feel it too," he whispered. The heartbeat grew louder. The walls groaned as though something massive pressed against them from all sides. And then the ice itself began to sing. It wasn't a human sound. It was a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the ground, the air, the marrow of their bones. It rose and fell in waves, vibrating the teeth in their skulls. Torres dropped to his knees, hands clamped over his ears. But the sound only drilled deeper. Through the din, McCarthy staggered to the door. His face was lit with a strange ecstasy, a feverish glow. "It's calling us," he muttered. "It wants us." Torres lunged, but McCarthy flung the door open before he could stop him. The storm roared in, flaying their skin with ice. Snow filled the cabin in seconds, extinguishing the fire with a hiss. The heartbeat pounded louder now, echoing across the frozen expanse outside. And in the whiteout, Torres saw the lake. It glowed. The ice pulsed with light, veins of pale blue radiating outward like a spider web. The cracks glimmered, alive, spreading farther and farther. Shapes writhed beneath the surface, more distinct than ever. Faces, hands, entire bodies pressed against the barrier, mouths opening in silent cries. They weren't just trapped. They were moving, writhing, twisting as though in agony. McCarthy stumbled forward, arms outstretched, laughing and sobbing all at once. "Do you see them?" he shouted into the gale. "They're alive down there. Alive." Torres grabbed him, but McCarthy spun with sudden violence, striking him across the jaw. Torres reeled, dazed. When he looked up again, McCarthy was already at the edge of the lake, arms raised like a preacher. The ground split. With a thunderous crack, the ice yawned open beneath McCarthy's feet. He didn't scream. He welcomed it. The glow swallowed him whole, and in the next instant, the fissure sealed shut, smooth and perfect, as though nothing had ever broken. The hum stopped. The heartbeat stilled. The storm died into silence. Torres stood alone. For a long time, he didn't move. He stared at the lake, chest heaving, waiting for McCarthy to claw his way back to the surface. But the ice remained still, silent, glowing faintly with the memory of what it had taken. When he finally stumbled back into the cabin, his body shook with cold and terror. The fire was dead, the room buried in snow, the air colder than a tomb. He collapsed onto his bunk, pulling the blankets over his head like a child. For the first time since arriving in this place, Torres prayed not for salvation, but for death. But death would not come so easily. That night, the dreams began. He saw the lake in his sleep, endless and black. He saw Donnelly, Jensen, McCarthy, all of them drifting beneath the surface, their bodies pale, their eyes open. They reached for him, mouths moving in unison. He woke with his sheets drenched in sweat, his heart hammering, only to realize the whispers were still there. Not dreams, not illusions. They seeped through the walls, through the ice, through his very skin. Torres pressed his hands to his ears, but the whispers sank deeper, curling into his thoughts. They spoke not in words, but in hunger, a promise, a command. The lake wanted him. By dawn, Torres knew what he had to do. Not escape. There was no escape. Not resist. Resistance was impossible. there was only one path left. The ice was alive, and it was waiting. The cabin no longer felt like shelter. It was a coffin waiting for its lid to be nailed shut. Torres knew this now. He hadn't lit the stove again after McCarthy was taken. The thought of fire seemed laughable in a land where the cold itself was alive, patient, watching. He wrapped himself in blankets and huddled in the dark, listening to the wind scrape against the walls. It wasn't the wind. Not anymore. The sound outside had changed. It was softer now, more deliberate. A dragging like hands across the cabin's walls. Sometimes a tapping, gentle and precise, like fingers testing where the wood was weakest. The voices had stopped calling his name. They no longer needed to. The lake had already marked him. Torres tried not to sleep, but exhaustion dragged him under. And when sleep came, so did the dreams. He dreamed of the lake stretching out forever, no horizon, no shore. A frozen mirror over an abyss. Beneath it, faces pressed against the ice in the thousands. Eyes open, mouths stretched in silent wails. They reached upward in perfect unison, hands splayed, palms trembling. Donnelly Jensen, McCarthy, all of them. And beyond them, more faces, ancient and nameless, an ocean of the drowned. In the dream, Torres walked onto the lake. His boots cracked the surface with every step, yet he did not sink. The ice trembled, glowing, breathing, alive beneath him. And then, with every heartbeat, he felt himself sinking. Not his body, but his soul, inch by inch, until the voices were not beneath him anymore, but within him. He woke screaming, the blankets tangled around his body, the cabin walls shaking. And when he ripped the frost from the window with his fist, he saw the glow again. The lake was pulsing, veins of light threading across its surface. It was calling. Torres knew there was no choice left. The others had been chosen in turn, one by one, until only he remained. The lake was patient, but not endless. It would wait for him until his mind broke completely. He could not fight it. He could not flee it. The only choice was when. He left the cabin before dawn. The air was still, unnaturally so, as though the storm had paused to watch. The snow crunched beneath his boots, brittle, sharp. His breath plumed out in ragged bursts, freezing against his beard. The lake stretched before him like a sheet of glass. The glow beneath it rippled faintly, as though it knew he was coming. Torres walked. Every step echoed in the stillness. The ice groaned underfoot, but it did not crack. Shadows writhed beneath him, faces twisting, mouths moving. He could not hear their cries, but he could feel them in his chest. At the center of the lake, he stopped. The glow surged. The ice beneath him pulsed like the chest of some enormous beast, rising and falling with breath. He dropped to his knees, hands pressed to the surface. The cold was absolute, searing his skin. burning straight to the bone. And then, at last, the voices returned. They were inside his head now, deafening a chorus of thousands. Not cruel, not kind, just inevitable. A tide that could not be resisted. Take me, Torres whispered. Though his lips were numb, his voice broken. I'm ready. The ice answered. It split open with a clean, surgical crack. The fissures spread beneath him, and the glow rose in a blinding wave. Water surged upward, black and endless, swallowing him whole. There was no scream, no struggle, only silence as the ice closed again, sealing smooth and perfect. The lake returned to stillness. The glow dimmed. The storm resumed. The cabin stood empty, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The stove was cold, the bunks unmade, the whiskey cups half filled with ice. No footprints remained in the drifts outside. By spring, when the thaw came, no one found the bodies. The lake gave nothing back. And yet, sometimes, on the coldest nights, the villagers swore they heard voices bleeding through the ice, crying, begging, laughing, always laughing.